result is that you have, in many units of the army, let's say Ministry of Defense Subordinated Forces, in many units, people will not obey an order issued by anyone above the rank of major. Okay? So, forgive me for going further. When we discuss whether to arm Ukraine or not, it's a typical Western preoccupation. It's not the issue. If you just give arms to this unreformed force structure and system, you are not addressing a real problem. The real problem is somehow for Ukraine's partners to do whatever it takes to persuade Poroshenko that he has to change this system and get back on the track that was running very, very well in the past. And of course, tie this to a program of assistance which will not work unless it does include a lethal military component. Okay, so that's the challenge, which also is the same point about corruption. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Prime Minister, has been astonishingly brilliant at describing how serious corruption is, what its effects are. He has appointed some extremely good people in some important ministries. But his actions in many cases are the exact opposite of what he talks about doing. And this is now understood by people, and so in Ukraine you basically have the following division of opinion. Opinions divided between the angry brigade who say we had expectations and they betrayed us again, and the others who say, what can you expect? We knew this was going to happen. These are transitional figures. We are keeping them under pressure. They're not going to be here forever. They're at least better than the last lot, and they come from the same culture of power. You can't expect much more, and we're still making progress. Now, you know, people who think like that, when they're talking about making progress, they really mean progress is going to lead to victory when my son is in university. It's not going to be this year or next year. That's what they mean. So you want to know what the atmosphere is like there now? It's like London in Kiev. It's like London during the Blitz without Churchill. One of the key reasons why there's no third Maidan is everyone understands the war is more important. The war is the thing. A third Maidan can only benefit the Russians. We'd like to put these people on meat hooks, but we're not going to do it. You've got to be impressed by this. The problem is too often when we talk about Ukraine and when Western governments do and aid agencies and all the rest of it, they're only talking about official Ukraine and they miss the point. One of my friends was, a couple of weeks ago when I was there, he said, what is the IMF doing here? Why are they not extending this money? We're on the edge of an abyss. I said, haven't they told you? He said, well, Lagarde said on radio, you can't disperse aid during war, only in peace. And, you know, we're absolutely in a rage. We don't know what to say or do. I said, she said that? Yes. Oh. Well, don't you know, I said, that the reason that the IMF mission has extended its stay here is because they can see that the people in charge are stealing and they're not going to give money for that purpose, and they are going to the brink, pushing them to do real things. Oh, well, how on earth are we supposed to know this? We are Ukraine, they are not Ukraine. How are we supposed to know this if they don't tell us that's what they're doing? If that's what they're doing, good for them. But we have not got that right, you see. Okay, long, circuitous response to a very important subject. Yes, sir, so you.
Martin.
If you are behind this cameraman and want to ask a question, could you come sit somewhere else, because I won't be able to see you.
Yes. Martin Škaprans, University of Latvia. Actually, I have a rather heuristic question, which was...
What kind of question?
Heuristic.
Heuristic?
Yeah,
okay, fine, yes.
Which was inspired by a recent article actually published today on the Washington Post by Alexander Motili. And he's kind of criticizing a realist approach towards, you know, explaining Putin's behavior. And following from this, I wanted to ask you, where do you draw the line in current Putin's policy between rational and irrational intentions?
Great. one has to ask oneself this question afresh every day. Okay? The problem with people who call themselves realists is that they're completely unrealistic. They somehow imagine that, because the 19th century world as they see it was much more tidy than our own, we could just go back to these rules. And it's not very realistic, is it? Because we're not living in the 19th century. And actually, they're very bad historians because the 19th century world was a world of a lot of little wars all the time. In any case, rationality. From an almost theocratic point of view, from an almost theocratic point of view, take issue with those who say Putin is irrational. By and large, he's been completely rational. But you have to understand his premises, and not just his premises, the premises of people around them. If you understand the world as it appears from the Kremlin, then you assess the correlation of forces in this whole contest very differently from the way our governments have. And guess what? We've been the ones who've been consistently surprised. The only thing that really surprised Putin was Angela Merkel's firm endorsement and instrumental role in finally putting in place in Europe the enhanced Tier 3 sanctions. They were not expecting that. But they've always understood. First of all, understand this about him, the environment he comes from. President Putin is a graduate with highest honors of an academy which is dominated by a high-risk culture. And he is a high-risk player. But the risks, certainly until all this started, that he has undertaken have been well calculated. He knows he is dealing with leaders in the West who are the products of low-risk cultures. He therefore concludes that in a real contest like this one, the weak side is not the side with the most to lose, it's the side that's most afraid of losses. Now, is that irrational? I don't think so. But it's not our view of rationality, which is highly templated and which comes from a whole set of wonderfully comforting positivist and liberal assumptions. Use the word heuristic, so I'm responding in that vocabulary. The latest example, as some of you might have noticed, the White House decided to hold an international conference on combating dangerous extremism. The word Islamic is not supposed to be used. And who has been invited? Russian delegation headed by whom? Mr. Bortnikov, head of the FSB, despite the fact that he's on a sanctions list. Now, tell me, if you're in the Kremlin, how do you interpret this? Do you interpret this as a sign that the United States is really steadfast and pursuing a no-nonsense policy? What do you conclude? I know what the White House wants them to conclude. You see, we're open to cooperation and we still have common interests and we'll do, we're willing to work with you in a pragmatic way. Putin is really he's going to have to lie down and say, I've got the United States completely wrong. They're really nice and reasonable people. What do we expect them to conclude from something like that? So anyway, I would say theocratically, my view is that what we are looking at are two different systems of rationality in conflict. Now, add to that my last point about fear. Angela Merkel has spent more time with Putin than anyone from the West. She believes, and she might be right, that this fellow is capable of crossing red lines that he doesn't know exist and doing very dangerous and scary things. She might be right. Okay? And, one more point. She might be right, but it is unmistakably, ascertainably true that there are Kremlin intermediaries and посредники running around and articles being planted that are designed to persuade us that Putin is crazy. Don't provoke him because he's crazy, he'll do something. Now, there might be a bit of truth in it at this point. I don't know. What we do know is what he's done unprovoked. That we do know. So, you're focusing on this. So, this is, again, it's not a simple question. Yes?
My name is Todd Ross. I'm a philosopher by discipline, so you can attack me there. I'll first give you my question. What do you think is the influence of the changing of the petrodollar upon this Russian time limit? You gave a 2-year period. That's a very concrete question. But then I want to give a little bit of a context, at least what I'm thinking about. The information struggle, the information war,
yeah.
And I was thinking of the understanding attainment that is happening. I'm thinking of how technology is implementation of real understanding, or e-government as it's going forward. I'm thinking about spheres of influence, like George Friedman had given. He's saying from the Russian perspective, they see NATO with Turkey, they see the Baltic line, and it's quite understandable. He wants to get a little more area of influence, at least as a regional player. He perhaps sees himself no longer as a world player. And then I'm also thinking of something like when the military and political regime are coalesced, like under Putin, and your mention of culture and civil society, natural resources, this all comes back to me about thinking about the petrodollar. What do you think that this petrodollar, or I don't care, petroeconomy, what it's doing to Putin now that we see a slamming of the prices and his power in that 2-year frame that you were talking about?
Okay. First, I am not a philosopher, and I also am not an economist, but I obviously spend a reasonable part of my time talking to people who are experts in the Russian economy, and also talking to people in the city of London, which I trust you all know is not London, it's the Finansový okrug of London, about all this. 2 years is the conservative estimate of what I hear, and the reason it's so long is that Russia started all of this with huge volumes of reserves. And if you look at these reserves, they're actually much smaller. The part of it which is liquid is actually much smaller than the public figures suggest. So they're taking a big hit. But if you're playing a high-risk game, and you think, as Putin does, geopolitics is more important than economics, then, and you think your opponent is going to crack, you can keep up appearances. You know the expression that gentlemen have, keeping up appearances, even after your money is gone. You can do this for quite some period of time, and that is all that I'm suggesting they're doing. They know they're in trouble, and in fact, basically the custodians of the energy system have announced that the old model of energy production, supply and distribution is finished, and they're now trying to create a new model. Well, the best of British luck. They are in trouble for a lot of reasons. The oil price is the symptom of why they are in trouble. This has been building up for years. Now, a more interesting question, George Friedman. Forgive me, I think someone is missing the point here. You go into rooms with Russians and say, why you're showing a double standard in criticizing us for insisting on a sphere of influence when NATO has a sphere of influence, the EU has a sphere of influence. Why can't Russia have it? And the answer they will get is always the same. That countries ask to join the EU and NATO. The first answer from the EU and NATO when a country asks to join is it's one of two, no or maybe. The greatest drag on the process of NATO and EU enlargement have been NATO and the EU themselves. We are committed to a model of security that is based on the free choice and the independently derived interests of states. And we're committed to this not because we are angels, but because we think the world operates better in that way. All of Russian integration projects have been driven by Russian national interests. You know, Nikita Khrushchev once said about global communism, the world is inevitably advancing towards global communism. History does not ask whether you want it or not. Well, this is the same rhetoric you hear about integration in the CIS from Russia's current leaders. So, summer 2013, Armenia, which is a member of the CSTO, was making enormous progress in meeting the criteria for signing the EU association agreement and was going to do this. And Putin had a summit and basically said to the Armenian president, as in the film Godfather 1, in 30 seconds, either your signature or your brains will be on this piece of paper. Now, this is a very different way of doing business. Okay? Even Nursultan Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, who is also been a big supporter of Eurasian integration for all sorts of reasons, and is a very wise man, a very Delphic player, very discreet, has said publicly at a Eurasian Customs Union summit, this is being used, the rules are being violated and being manipulated in the interests of particular states and not in the interests of everyone. And this has always been the way it is. Lukashenko as well of Belarus, same perception. So the issue is not are there spheres of influence, but how do they emerge? That's what makes them legitimate or not, and we have two different views about this. I'm not suggesting you sit down and have a reasonable discussion and persuade them that they're mistaken. We've been having these reasonable discussions for 20 years and look where we are now. Yes?
You already touched the personality of Putin, and maybe you will see this fear in my question, which you mentioned. That couldn't it be that Putin sees war like a play, and Georgia?
War like a what?
Like a play. A game. I'm sorry, game.
A game.
Yes.
Yes.
Starting with Georgia, the small scale, now bigger scale in Ukraine as a training field, and in this case, as a challenging continuation of this game could be something against NATO. And what I see, in my opinion, that we, Latvia and Estonia, are rather weak points in NATO because of against Russia, because of two points. So the first, because we are on the border with Russia, and secondly, because of our rather big Russian-speaking part of society, which is directly influenced from Russia's media and propaganda. What do you think about this?
Well, my answer to your question is yes, but. So first of all, yes. The predisposition, and you could say in many ways the purpose and the duty of the Russian General Staff has been to make preparations for future war or future wars. And there has been in recent years a growing preoccupation with how all these objective trends I've mentioned, new social technologies, the civic factor, coercive diplomacy, NATO enlargement, US intervention for humanitarian interventions around how all of this in the end will be targeted against Russia and can produce a major conflict. So there is no question that these security structures have been thinking about this for quite some time before this started. When Zapad 2009 was conducted, when that exercise took place, which I think you will remember was a massive combined arms exercise which ended with a nuclear strike on Warsaw. My view immediately, well, the received wisdom in Western capitals was they're doing this to intimidate everyone. My view immediately was they're doing this because they think this can happen. And frankly, if you look at that whole scenario and you remove the word Belarus and you replace it with the word Ukraine, then you see what they have in mind. So I do not think they exclude, by any means, exclude the possibility that what is happening in Ukraine can lead to a war between NATO and Russia. Okay? Now that's yes, but today, even as much as in the past, they see us as the aggressor here. Okay? They think they are simply defending their own legitimate interests. Remember, they perceive that Yanukovych was toppled by our special services, that this is the beginning of that whole relaunching this whole process directed against Russia, designed to destabilize Russia. And so therefore, I would say that if you ask a different question, does the Kremlin today want a war with NATO? I think the answer would be no. But they could end up getting one because just as we misunderstand how they think and the way they work, they misunderstand the way we work. Okay? And there are certain elements that are missing in their view of how their neighbors function. And one, they do not understand the social or humanitarian factor in its own terms. Let me just finish one thing. Part of what they don't understand is that they believe that Russian communities, wherever they live, are somehow objectively loyal to Russia and can be used as an instrument. When they started this whole business in eastern Ukraine, they really expected that this Russian-speaking population would rise up and support them. Instead, there was nothing. Virtually nothing in response. They're not prepared for this. They are capable, therefore, of staging provocations in the Baltic states, thinking something is going to happen, and instead the opposite happens, and they're in quite a predicament. So there is a real scope for miscalculation here, and it's one reason why this is a dangerous situation. Yes, sir.
Private entrepreneur. Dear gentlemen, what do you mean? Need Latvia start, build line on defense? Defense line, on all contact line with Russian Federation. We know in last century defense line names monarchy gave our neighbors from Finland Kiev democracy, democracy, and we have now very hard moment. But we know Parliament of Russia Federation gives accept permission of dictator to President of Russian Federation and accept the hybrid car. Hybrid car is simple simple 20th century blitzkrieg. We have in East this situation of blitzkrieg Barbarossa II, and need defense for all.
I'm not fully.
What's the question, please?
I'm not fully understanding. Would you be able to summarize this? I'm not
need to build,
hearing all of this.
Need to build a defense line.
Need to build defense line Latvia.
With Russia, of course.
Well, supposedly we have a defense line which is called NATO. I mean, I'm sorry to sound dogmatic. The challenge, you see, if you talk about deterrence, what does it mean? What it means is very simple. It means creating through your policy and your actions, convincing your opponent that anything he does against your interests, any crossing of a line, will cause him, will impose unacceptable costs upon him. That's what our policy, that's what deterrence has always meant. That's what it should be designed to do. The problem we have, and it's not new, is that many people who frame this policy of deterrence in the West don't understand the way the thinking and the priorities and the pain threshold and the risk threshold of people who make decisions in Russia, and therefore they do not accurately judge what the Russians regard as an unacceptable cost. They're thinking about themselves or supposedly any rational person when they do this, and not about the Kremlin. And that's the part which is worrying, because what we think is an effective deterrent might not be to someone in the Kremlin, particularly someone in the Kremlin who believes that his entire political system is at risk. That's the challenge. This even existed during the Cold War when, anyone remember Robert F. McNamara, the US Secretary of Defense, who framed this concept of mutual assured destruction and stipulated, in a nuclear exchange, so many deaths, the loss of so much infrastructure, so much industry, all the rest of it, and that if the Soviets look at this, they will know a nuclear war cannot be fought and won. And the Soviet Union kept developing more and more elaborate forms of nuclear offensive warfare, means of warfare, and the states didn't understand why. Well, part of the answer why is that if you look at McNamara's statistics, they are not very different from what the Soviet Union withstood in the first 6 or 7 weeks of Operation Barbarossa. And therefore, if you are a country that is, understands you can lose 25 million of your own people, you can lose in 6 weeks half your industry, you can lose half your infrastructure, and you can not only survive but go on and win and become the greatest power in Europe, then your understanding about these matters is a little different from what it is if you're a graduate of University of California in Berkeley. Okay? Well, this is the problem now, which I think we need to discuss more carefully. What do we mean by deterring Russia and the Baltic states, particularly when you are facing a completely different type of threat? You're not really talking here about a risk of armed attack. You're talking about, that's why I dwelt upon Ukraine. You are talking about a series of covert measures over time that are designed to incapacitate a state, and which can designed to produce rapid results with a limited amount of force before the other side knows what's happened. So what you're looking at is a whole concept of Russian operations, military intelligence interconnected, that are designed to achieve decisive results below NATO's threshold of reaction. And that's what we have to address. Did the Wales summit at NATO address that issue? I'm not sure. Yes, thanks. Yes, please.
Two questions. One is, what do you make of the comments of the UK's defence minister in regard to the Baltic states, which he mentioned very specifically? How do you interpret that? And the second question is, what do you see as Latvia's greatest weakness vis-à-vis Russia? And then can I offer you a definition of Putin, which comes out of the book of Kleptocracy. And the way I see it is that he's a rational, calculating gambler who has clear aims in the long run and in the short run. But the operative words would be rational, calculating gambler, which comes very clearly out of that book, because he was gambling a lot and he's got away with
Which book is this?
Kleptocracy.
Oh, you mean, yes, Karen Davisha.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Okay, I agree with the latter. I come back to that a first time. I mean, I would not put it in these terms myself, but I don't disagree with what she said. Starting with the first, I think that our Secretary of State for Defense was doing two things with these comments. He was expressing genuine concern about threats to security in the Baltic region, but he is also, in this way, trying to let both our allies and Moscow know that we are concerned, that we know, that we take this as important, we see what is going on. The problem, though, is how does Moscow really interpret it when they can plainly see that after a so-called strategic defense review in 2010, which weakened some of our core capabilities for monitoring and responding to Russian activity in Britain's vicinity, that we are now planning a further round of defense cuts. What makes the biggest impression on them? A statement by Michael Fallon or the actual budgetary decisions of the British government? Okay, the Latvia. And I think I would say the same if I were in Estonia. Lithuania is in a different category. Not entirely. One aspect relates to everyone, I think. If any Western country could address its own internal vulnerabilities, Russia would automatically become, Russia would become proportionately weaker. Russia's strengths grow in proportion to the vulnerabilities we have. A friend of mine who was a defector in the Cold War, he was deputy KGB resident in Tokyo. He defected to the States and I got to know him. And he wrote a few books. His name is Stanislav Levchenko. He had a very good axiom. He said, look for your vulnerabilities and there you will find the KGB. Okay? Now, vulnerabilities here, there are two. The first is that, because as a state that is only relatively recently, for 2 decades, regained its independence and whose administrative culture had to be rebuilt or built from fresh in the wake of a Soviet administrative culture, there are still some significant gaps in morale, cohesion, and professionalism when it comes to a number of key state institutions. And very difficult to remedy these without money, without proper career structures, without the sort of salaries that confine corruption to genuinely corrupt people rather than make corruption a response to an untenable situation. So I think that compared to some other countries, compared, say, to Sweden or the UK, it is relatively easy for Russian special services operating through business to penetrate and influence political and some state and official structures in Latvia. Maybe less so at a national level, but more so at a local level. Vulnerability number one, and that would apply to Lithuania as well. It would apply to Estonia a few years back. The situation is doubtless better now. I remember sitting around the table with the Prime Minister's cabinet and someone going around the table whispering in my ear, this one takes $50,000 a year from Gazprom, this one takes X, this one is a friend of so-and-so, and so on and so forth. Frightening picture. Second, obviously, the elephant in the room, the Russian community of Latvia. And I'd say the same if I were in Estonia, and what I'd say is not popular. There is no question that when your government representatives are asked about this, the answer they always give is correct. The answer they give is that the vast majority of Russian speakers here, even the non-citizens who are Russian speakers, know the difference between living in an EU country, in a rules-based system with human rights, and living in Russia, and they would rather live here and not there. Fine. The problem is that most of these people are still not integrated in society. I won't ask the question, how many Russian speakers there are in this room. There might be some of you, but normally I would not expect in a discussion of this kind to see many. There is a difference between having a minority that prefers to live here and is in that sense loyal, and a minority that really thinks it's fully integrated and that it belongs here and it's fully part of the way of life and just has a different linguistic background. I don't say this from a superior position because Britain's own difficulties with minorities, and particularly religious minorities of certain kinds and certain generations, do not make me feel at all comfortable. So many of us suffer from problems of this nature. What I do know is that our problems in the UK cannot be exploited by Russia. I know they're exploited by people who are very, very visible in Iraq at the moment, but not by people in Russia. But you're in a different position. So that would be my answer. I think we have time for one or two more quick questions. Yes, please.
My name is from Ministry of Defense of Latvia. My question is, are there any fundamental mistakes or miscalculations made by the West dealing with post-Soviet Russia and Ukraine with post-Soviet area during the last 2 decades?
Yes.
And could you elaborate?
Yes. First of all, in the 1990s, I was working with a small group of people. At times, it felt like there were only 4 of us, 6 of us against the world. Well, 10 of us. First of all, saying, making it clear, do not try to micromanage Russia. Do not assume that Russia is capable of becoming like us and that they want to become like us. And stop thinking of yourself as teachers and them as pupils. I remember, mentioning someone very senior inside our Ministry of Defense in the early 1990s saying to me, James, we don't know what you and your colleagues are talking about. They're just little children. They don't understand, and we're helping them. And I said to her, I was so angry, I said to her, these little children will have you for breakfast and not even know they've eaten anything. Okay? So you could see that we caused deep resentment. It was not because we were trying to harm them. I was there, I was part of this. We were actually trying to help, and we were dealing with people who knew we were trying to help. But what we made it possible for Putin to create a new Versailles legend. That, this decade of humiliation, they're always going on about this, they're exaggerating it, and what they're saying is, we were really trying to damage Russia. No, we weren't trying to damage Russia. But we did behave in a way that damaged their self-esteem, and we did not know what we were doing and what we were talking about. I don't have time necessarily here, but I had, my one really long substantive discussion with Margaret Thatcher was about this, because she really thought there that Boris Yeltsin is applying Thatcherism to Russia. I said there's no Thatcherism possible in these circumstances. Margaret Thatcher over 13 years diminished the state's role in our GDP from 11% to 5.5%. It was incredibly difficult. The establishment said you won't be able to do it. There were crisis after crisis. She did it over 13 years. She had behind her some of the most competent, effective, well-run institutions in the democratic world, and still it was so difficult. And I said, now you look at Russia, all these institutions are collapsed. Everyone has been educated in a completely different way. Even with the black market, 70% of the economy was dependent on the state. What is really going to happen there, God only knows, but they're not going to become a liberal, they're not going to just develop on the ruins of this, a liberal market economy without some number of other things happening first. So that was our biggest mistake, not to have anticipated this, and not to have done as much listening as talking, and in a spirit of equality. And I think we should have had one message to the Russians from the beginning. Our core interest in the West is that Russia should be at peace with itself and its neighbors. How you do that is fundamentally your business. If you want our advice, we'll give it to you, but most of the time you ask us a question, we'll say we don't know. Okay, that's the biggest. I don't think NATO enlargement was a fundamental error, or EU enlargement, but what was an error was not anticipating what the consequences would have been. That was the problem. Last brief question? Yes, please. Yeah, please.
My question is, whose initiative is a Minsk peace process about Ukraine? Is that the way Mr. Lukashenko improves his relationships with the West, or rather it's determined in Kremlin is the most suitable place for Russia to have it as a neutral?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nobody desires Russia's defeat in Ukraine more than President Lukashenko, because he knows if Russia is victorious there, he will be next. President Lukashenko runs the most tightly authoritarian state in Europe. It's more authoritarian than Russia is even now. Okay? But he has been, on this basis, a very effective guardian of Belarus's independence. He does not want to be subordinated to Putin. He and Putin cordially dislike one another. They have conducted a struggle between them of a very shrewd kind, because they are both very shrewd players. This man, Alexander Lukashenko, is the most underestimated political figure in Europe. He was there before Putin arrived, and I think he will still be in power after Putin leaves. Right, so thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Серьезная работа.